Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on Chapter 1, The Origin of the Idea of Race. The learning goals for this chapter are as follows. What are race and ethnicity, and what is racism? We'll learn what those things mean. How old is racism? How is race distinct from previous ways of thinking about human difference? How did the writers of the US Constitution think of slavery? How did the Indian Removal Act affect Native Americans? And what role did science play in the propagation of racism? So this chapter begins with a section from the 1619 project. This is the project authored by Nicole Hannah-Jones, where she explains a contradiction embedded in the founding of the United States. Founders of the nation claimed to value liberty. However, the US was not only founded on slavery, it also owes to formerly enslaved people its democracy. This opening excerpt is from the 1619 project, which encourages readers to rethink their understanding of American history. In this contradiction between what we say is a fundamental principle of the United States and the actual practices in our history, is the foundation to understanding race and racism in this country still today. So it's important to understand what the Declaration of Independence expresses as the ideal for this country, that everyone is created equal and that everyone has liberty as one of their unalienable rights. But Black Americans who have not experienced this throughout the entire history of this country have been foundational to the idea of American freedom, because their existence first as slaves made the contradiction really overt, but also because throughout their history in this country, fighting for their liberation and their freedom, they have in a way been upholding what the ideal of American freedom actually means. Today, when people in the United States meet each other, they often want to know what their racial identity is. This is often encapsulated in the question, what are you? It is important to recognize that in the early 1600s, one would not have described people using the terms like Native American, white, or Black. This highlights how race is a social construction. And by social construction, the reading explains, we mean the idea of race is not based on biological differences among people, but on social perception. So that is what we mean when we talk about race as a social construction. The reading also talks about the differences between the terms race and ethnicity, which sometimes we use interchangeably and are confused about. The term race is a social construction used to describe a group of people who share physical traits, cultural traits, and a common ancestry. Ethnicity, on the other hand, refers to group identity based on notions of similar and shared culture, kinship, and history. This is an example of the definitions that exist for these different racial groups within the US Census Bureau, and is an example of how race is institutionalized. And I want to take a moment to read through these definitions, because sometimes we're surprised about what the definitions, official definitions by the government are. So for example, white is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa, right? Which is interesting because we might assume that all white people are those who originate from Europe, but the Middle East and North Africa might be a little bit surprising to us. Black or African American, and here we see the interesting point that these two terms are used, Black or African American, defined as a person having origins in any of the Black racial groups of Africa. Okay, so it's defined by racial groups within the continent of Africa. American Indian or Alaska Native is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America, and who maintains tribal affiliation or community attachment. okay? And the important thing here to note is this idea of maintaining tribal affiliation or community attachment. What if you are an American Indian or identify as indigenous person from North, South, or Central America, but you don't have a tribal affiliation, okay? Asian is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. And one thing to note about this particular category is the wide differences between all the different countries that are listed there, who are also countries that have had sometimes conflicts with each other historically. And yet here in the United States, they're all lumped together as being part of the same group. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific islands. The reading describes also what is defined or what they define racism to be. Racism refers to both the belief that races are populations whose physical differences are linked to significant cultural and social differences within a hierarchy, and two, the practice of subordinating races believed to be inferior. Racism as a belief system is an ideology. An ideology is a set of principles and ideas that benefit the dominant group. The racial ideologies that operate today reflect our times and are rooted in the history of the Americas. And here is important again to note these two particular distinctions of racism. It is a belief and also a practice, okay? Now, what do we mean by race as a historical construction? It means that the idea of race was formed in particular times and places. One of those periods of time was the era of colonialism, and has been used as a justification for different historical atrocities like slavery, colonialism, and genocide. And so there's a direct tie between what race is at any given point of time and what's happening historical in a particular moment in time. And I'm sorry if you hear the whining in the background, that is my dog Basil whining because he wants to go outside to chase the squirrels. Before the colonization of the Americas, there were important historical precedents to the idea of race. During the Spanish Inquisition, which began in the late 15th century, Jewish and Muslim people suffered from suspicion, scrutiny, and discrimination. Additionally, English soldiers often portrayed Irish people as savage, sexually immoral, and unwilling to civilize. Such ideas might have influenced settlers' perceptions of Native Americans as being savage. So as the Spanish and the English came to this part of the world, they're already bringing, right, this practice of having discriminatory ideas, prejudicial ideas about other people. Slavery was present in African, European, and Middle Eastern societies long before the colonization of what would become known as the Americas. Though there was brutal treatment during ancient times, the humanity of slaves was never put into question, and slavery was not attributed to racial inferiority. So it's important to make that distinction. Sometimes people say, well, you know, Africans also own slaves, or slavery has existed throughout history in other parts of the world. And this is true, but the idea of race was not attached to who could be a slave. In order to tell the story of race in the Americas, we have to go back at least until 1492. When Christopher Columbus and his crew arrived in the Caribbean, they did not think of themselves as white. Also, when they encountered the native peoples of the Caribbean islands, they found them to be peaceable and generous. Despite the Spaniards' initial admiration for the indigenous people, relations deteriorated as it became clear that the Spaniards' primary motive was to extract gold from the Americas, and that they needed a labor force to extract that gold for them. Despite their admiration of Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards did not preserve the city. The arrival of the Spaniards led to the destruction of many towns and cities across the Americas. The population of Central Mexico was decimated in less than a century. This pattern continued throughout the Americas, so that almost 95% of the native populations were destroyed in less than 200 years. Thus, this is one example of the role of genocide in history and in defining then different groups as different or inferior from the Europeans. The reading talks about what made slavery in North America distinct, talking about the slave codes, which were laws enacted in the 1660s that clearly distinguished the status of African slaves and European indentured servants. In colonial America, eventually all Africans were enslaved and all whites were free, solidifying the idea of race. The slavery that emerged in North American colonies was unique in several ways. First, enslaved people did not have human or legal rights. Second, slavery was permanent and their status was inherited. Third, enslaved people were forbidden from learning to read or write. And finally, slavery in North America was unique insofar as nearly all Africans and their descendants were enslaved, solidifying the distinction between whites and blacks. Blacks were slaves, whites were not. The reading also talks about how the distinction between whites and blacks is solidified, and particularly how working class whites are incorporated into the idea of whiteness. And the reading in particular talks about Bacon's Rebellion, where white indentured servants joined forces with enslaved Africans and freedmen to protest their conditions. This massive rebellion, in which protesters demanding an end to their servitude burned Jamestown to the ground, was a clear threat to the status quo. In the aftermath, whites were granted additional rights and privileges in an effort to ensure that they did not act in solidarity with Africans. In other words, Bacon's Rebellion was a rebellion that brought together the poor whites and blacks, freed and enslaved Africans. And this kind of collaboration, solidarity between these two populations was something that the white elites certainly did not want to happen. And so in order to make sure that this kind of rebellion did not happen again, or at least this kind of solidarity between poor whites and blacks did not take place again, they began to pass laws to give working class whites more rights and to make them therefore distinct from blacks. In 1705, a law was passed requiring masters to provide to formerly indentured servants 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings, a gun, and 50 acres of land. Really interesting, the specifics of what was given to them. This tactic of giving servants a piece of the American dream was intended to avoid rebellion by convincing poor white people that the rich landowners were not extortionists or enemies, but protectors of their common interests. The reading also talks about slavery versus the ideal of freedom in the United States. Although the concept of liberty was at the core of the American Revolution, many men who made up the 1787 Constitutional Convention owned slaves. Most of the writers of the founding documents profited directly or indirectly from slavery. The contradiction between the ideals of freedom and the presence of Black slavery led to justifications for slavery due to claims of Black people's alleged racial inferiority. And so, for example, there are the writings by Thomas Jefferson, where he validated the belief that people of African descent were inferior. In Notes on Virginia, he states, quote, "Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to whites in the endowment both of body and mind. And so this is how they could justify, on the one hand, talking about freedom and liberty in the Constitution and so on, and all of them owning slaves, right, was to say, well, these particular people, Black people, are not the same as us. And therefore, when we're talking about freedom for all men, we don't mean that. The reading also talks about and makes this distinction on how the racial ideology around Native Americans was distinct from African Americans. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 enabled the administration of President Andrew Jackson to use military power to displace at least 70,000 Native Americans, killing tens of thousands in the process. The justifications for Indian removal were distinct from those used for slavery, as whites tended to see Africans as a vital source of labor. On the contrary, Native Americans were construed as hindering white expansion, and thus the racial ideology surrounding Native Americans tended to explain and predict their gradual extinction and complete assimilation. Whereas colonists' ideas about Africans served to justify their hyper-exploitation of slaves, whites' ideas about Native Americans aimed to justify the assimilation and gradual extinction of these groups, enabling whites to appropriate Indian lands. So Blacks needed to exist but be kept in an inferior status because their labor was needed, whereas Native Americans needed to be removed, eventually become extinct, or completely assimilated into mainstream American culture so that they could be removed from their land and their land could be made available to whites. The other two interesting distinctions here is that intermarriage between whites and natives was not forbidden as it was between whites and African Americans. And the one drop rule, which defines any person with one drop of Black, quote unquote, blood as being Black, did not apply to Native Americans. Again, because the idea with Native Americans is that they were to become assimilated. Finally, the reading talks about the role of science in the development of racism. And as we see here in this illustration from Josiah Clark Knott and George Robert Gliddon's book, Indigenous Races of the Earth, which was published in 1857, it shows the perceived differences of the white man, the Black man, and the chimpanzee. Think about how powerfully racist such images can be when they are understood as legitimate science by a society. The early divisions of the world were based on the view of colonizers and conquistadores. With the beginning of the Enlightenment, the divisions became more scientific or pseudoscientific. When scientists began to classify all of humankind into 4 races, they did so based on these prevailing ideologies. Native Americans were characterized as carefree and not able to manage the land they were inhabiting. Asians were characterized as opinionated and haughty. Africans were characterized as lazy, meaning they must be enslaved if they were to work. And Europeans characterized themselves as intelligent and superior. And one thing to note here is how many of these ideas still exist today as stereotypes of some of these different groups. In the 18th century, European thinkers used the tools at their disposal to categorize all of humanity into 4 or 5 races. These divisions were not based on anything we would today characterize as scientific. Instead, these divisions were based on these thinkers' perceptions of the world. Scientific racism continued into the 19th century. Samuel George Morton amassed over 1,000 skulls of Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans to test his hypothesis that larger brains meant higher intelligence. His measurements, which later were shown to have a tremendous margin of error, always found that Europeans were more intelligent. It is somewhat remarkable that his errors always favored Europeans. When Morton passed away, the Charleston Medical Journal published a memoir stating, quote, "We can only say that we of the South should consider him as our benefactor for aiding most materially in giving to the Negro his true position as an inferior race. So the science, the quote unquote science of the times, was really being used to solidify and affirm the idea in the South of Black people being inferior and therefore deserving to be enslaved. Again, I apologize for my dog. And we saw in the readings, when you actually look at some of these measurements and the skulls that were being used, where some of the inherent bias was there in the supposed scientific experiments. So the key takeaways from this lecture are, first, that race is a social construction, that race is a historical construction, and we've seen already in this chapter some of those historical moments that have served to construct what race is and create racial distinctions, and that race is not rooted in biology. Okay, so this ends our lecture for this week. I will see you guys next week. Take care.